All right, let's go ahead and get started. Um, Making another video. I did get some feedback, but at least some people told me they enjoyed the videos and they would like to see more of them. So we are now in week 3, all right? And so, each week, and I encourage you to do the same thing, look at the syllabus, right? So go log into Canvas and look at the syllabus, look up week 3, which we're in, and you'll see, we're reading the chapter on culture. You'll also see in bold below that we have a quiz this week. And there's my daughter walking in. I'll help you with math homework in a second, baby. And yeah, and so this week, sorry, I got distracted by my daughter. We're covering chapter 2, right? And we have a quiz, and that'll be due on Sunday, and that's kind of typical schedule for the week. I do want to, give you some forewarning that next week we will cover chapter 3. We will have a discussion board, right, instead of a quiz, and then we will have our first exam, right? We need to get through this chapter on culture, and next week we'll get through the chapter on socialization, all right? All right, so we're talking about culture, right? And boy, it's hard. It's hard to get started talking about society or sociology or any of that without making references to culture. So I've already talked some last week about culture, but this will give it our full weekly treatment, right? So we'll dive further into this topic, right? And when we think about culture, culture plays a really important role in human beings' life, and it doesn't so much in animals, right? One of the things that's really important about humans and separates us from other animals is culture. It's difficult for me to overemphasize how important that is, right? And so we have this entire symbolic world, language, writings, the spoken word, names for things, right? And norms, values, all these elements of culture. And that is really significant. It is, mind-blowing, maybe, awesome thing about us, right? So I want you to kind of think about that as I continue talking about this. You may hear my kids in the background, and I apologize about that. But I'll try not to get distracted. All right, so the first thing is like, what, you've said culture many times. What do you mean by culture, right? And it is the strategy that humans have for survival, right? It is the ways of thinking, acting, in material objects that together form a people's way of life, right? And when we think about culture, there's really two different parts, right? There's non-material, the world of ideas, and then there's material, the world of things, technology, artifacts, right? And in the knowledge to use that technology or artifacts as well, right? So that's non-material and material, right? And if you've ever traveled, particularly out of the country, you have probably encountered cultures that are quite different than us. Now, you can also encounter cultures quite different than us within our country, right? There are cultural differences with other nations, but they're also because the United States is multicultural society, and we'll talk about greater that. You can experience culture shock within our own country, right? And culture shock, what that is, that occurs when an individual experiences disorientation, right? When experiencing an unfamiliar way of life, right? So basically, if you've ever had the experience of going to Mexico or traveling to Miami, right, which the Hispanic culture is quite prevalent, or you've gone to a place like Chinatown in San Francisco or something like that, it was probably immediately impressed upon you, like lots of people are speaking languages other than English, right? And first time I ever went in Chinatown in San Francisco, I was like, boy, even at the McDonald's, the menu is in Chinese, right? And same with Spanish and Miami and other Costa Rica, Mexico, other places I've traveled. And that not knowing how to interpret things, becoming disoriented in this other culture or world of meaning, that's culture shock. And it can be disoriented and you don't know what to expect. People talk to you, you don't know what they mean, right? That's culture shock, right? You don't know their norms. Maybe you're not familiar with their ways of dress. You're not familiar with their eating habits and recipes and stuff like that. But you can learn about their culture if you stick around for a while, and you will experience less cultural shock as you learn that symbolic world of this culture, right? And if you've never experienced that, oh boy, I imagine you probably have, right? So there's also a story in here in the book where it talks about the Yanomamo tribe in the Amazon. And when a rather famous anthropologist met them for the first time, they have greeting norms that are quite different than us. They don't shake hands and look people in the eyes and say, right? But instead they oftentimes kind of a threatening situation and involves spit and all sorts of stuff. So we would kind of think was gross and stuff like that, right? And that's cultural differences between us and them, right? And and human beings, like we use culture to survive, and we have to teach each other about culture. I'm gonna pause for a second and tell my kids to pipe down a little bit and close the door. All right, sorry about that. I don't know if y'all can hear this or not, but I can certainly hear it just distracting to me as I make the video. But I have a 8-year-old boy and a 10-year-old girl. Love them to death, but they have a tendency to fight all waking moments of the day. So they were kind of getting into a little tiff while they were playing video games in the next room. So, all right, I told them, like, I'm making a video, please pipe down a little bit. All right, so hopefully we won't get interrupted again. I'm sorry for stopping. All right, I think the point that I was trying to make, and I've already said it once, is like culture is vitally important to humans, and we use it as a strategy for survival, right? And when we're born into this world, little babies, they really can't survive. They survive on other people that know about the culture, and then over a very long period of time through socialization, they learn the culture, and eventually, hopefully, right? And it sometimes takes years and maybe decades for some of us before we can survive without the assistance of our parents, right? And the reason why that takes so long is because we have to learn the culture. When we move to another place, we have to learn that different culture as well, right? If you live in a multicultural, you kind of have to navigate different cultures, right? And some of us can do that better than others, right? Yeah, and it's only humans that are dependent upon culture like this. You know, there's no other animal, right? They're largely dependent upon instinct, right? And humans probably haven't always depended upon culture. There was probably moments in our, caveman past, you might think of it, where we didn't really have culture. It wasn't largely developed, right? But you start seeing the beginning of it. Petroglyphs, cave paintings, if you studied art before. So we think culture has been around for thousands of years at least, in some parts of the world, perhaps tens of thousands of years, right? Yeah, but in the big picture of human beings in history, it's kind of recent, right? It's a new strategy for a different type of animal to survive, right? And I won't try to argue that humans are just like other animals. In fact, I'm making an argument that humans are quite different, right, than other animals. And one of those big differences is culture, right? So I won't be, making arguments that we're just like chimpanzees or we're just like apes or, and some of those, chimpanzees, you can teach them some words and some sign language, and scientists have been fairly successful. But they'll never be able to master culture like we can. You can't have a philosophical debate with the chimpanzee. You can, ask them for a banana or something. They give you a banana, but you can't have a really complicated intellectual cultural exchange or dialogue, right? All right. One of the things that really sets all primates, we are a primate, right? We share a number of things that are similar to other primates, chimpanzees, orangutans, bonobos, and stuff like that, is we're smart. They're smart too. They're really smart, right? All of those other animals are quite intelligent, right? And, another thing that some of those other primates share with us is the ability to use tools, right? And you might have at one point been told that, like, because we have these opposable thumbs, right? We can manipulate things. That's true, right? But there are other primates that have opposable thumbs. There's other primates that build tools. I mean, there's some other animals that build tools as well, like birds, like crows and stuff will build tools. You can teach a dog how to do it and stuff. But yeah, so we create objects. Anthropologists would call these artifacts. We have technology, right? And that allows us to manipulate the environment in a way that no other animal can do. We can build the environment, the built environment, the human buildings and landscapes and cities and civilization and pyramids and, skyscrapers and stuff like that, right? And we can fundamentally change our environment, that most of the environments of our own making, right? And not making, I didn't create it all, but other human beings did and stuff like that, right? Really sets us apart. That intelligence, that ability to have culture and to have the written word so we can pass knowledge from one generation to the next and transmit knowledge across civilizations, and even take something written in one language and translate it to another language. That really, that allows us to accumulate knowledge, right, and disperse knowledge into appropriate knowledge from other cultures as well. And then there's a kind of big saying, like we are able to stand upon the shoulders of giants, right? I would never be I don't know how smart you think I am, but I hope a little bit smart, right? But I would never be this smart without all the people that came before me, right? And that's what is meant by standing upon the shoulders of giants. That I have the knowledge that I have, right? However, big or small you think that is, right? I gained that through reading books from people throughout the ages, when I was a philosophy major, I read a lot of ancient Greek philosophy and stuff like that, right? And, those were people that I learned from, even though we were separated by thousands of years, right? And when I learned more about sociology, it's like Emile Durkheim, Karl Marx, Max Weber, these Irving Goffman, people I've never met, never will meet. Most of those, all those people are dead, right? But they changed my life and, the intellectual culture and my knowledge. I borrowed quite often from them. All right. So that phrase, standing on soldier giant, not in the book, but I like that phrase, right? So let's talk about the elements of culture, right? The elements of culture are these things. They're symbols, they're language, they're the words, right? They're norms, they're values, right? Those are all the important elements of culture, right? Norms, I think we've already talked about in previous, is like there are expectations that people have of you and the expectations that you have yourself. How do you know a norm exists? Well, violate it and someone will sanction you, right? If they're aware of you violating it, right? And that's how you know that norms exist. Norms always are accompanied by sanctions. Not in every case that they're broken, but, trying to think of, earlier we were talking about Yanomano and greeting norms. In our culture, we greet people, particularly men, right? Varies a little bit by gender. Extend your hand, you look the person in the eye. My name is Chris Pounds. It's nice to meet you, right? And you expect that other person, right? But if you don't follow those greeting norms, if you refuse to shake that person's hand, if you don't look them in the eye, if you don't tell them your name, right? You can kind of look at you weird. And when they walk off, they might gossip. And those are the sanctions, right? Those are kind of not serious sanctions. There are other norms, right? They're codified into law, right? You violate those, the sanctions are much bigger. Here's another norm in our society. You shouldn't kill people, particularly when it's unjustified. And if you do, you violated not only a norm, but a law. And if that comes to the attention of people, particularly authorities, they will come in and arrest you. And the possible sanctions will be very long prison sentence, possibly execution in the state of Alabama, right? Life without parole. Those are serious sanctions, right? Much more than gossip and stuff like that, right? So that's, when we talk about sanctions, we're talking about some very minor, some, right? Now, even if you violate those norms about greeting norms, that can, even though sanctions aren't big, people will think less of you. They'll kind of look at you funny and stuff when you shake their hands, and they might gossip about you. That can have big consequences for your life, right? For example, go on a job interview and you don't shake people's hands correctly, right? That could alter your life. It could mean you don't get this job. You have to take another job, and that could mean you live in this neighborhood, not this neighborhood, right? You save up for retirement, or you don't save up for retirement. It could affect even the well-being of your kids, and so the point that I'm trying to make there is that even the small norm violations can have huge consequences, right? Even though the sanctions aren't real severe. There's things like gossip and people look at you weird and stuff. All right. Early on in sociology, and this is kind of because they were mostly thinking about European nations, each nation had its own culture. It had its own language, right? So you lived in France, you speak French. You lived in England, you spoke English, so on, right? But things do begin to kind of change. And boy, look at the United States, right? We are a multinational, multicultural country. Immigrants moved into this country over hundreds of years. In fact, they continue to move in, right? Sometimes legally, sometimes not legally, right? And but they always have an effect upon our culture, right? It so happens that English kind of became the dominant language, but there are places, right, where other languages are spoken more often, right? And oh wait, I mean, think about. I live in Homewood, and I live, not too far from Green Springs, right? One of the things I love about living in Homewood, particularly near Green Springs, is all the different ethnic restaurants. So I can go to a Korean restaurant, multiple taco trucks. I can go to Chinese, and so that's one of the benefits of living in a multicultural society, and living in a multicultural region of Homewood and Birmingham, right? Yeah, enjoy that, right? It's one of the great things about the United States is the diversity of cultures, right? Yeah, some people agree with me, think that's a great thing. Other people want everyone to speak English, and they move here, discard their cultural practices, the way that they dress, the way that they talk, the way that they think, the way that they feel, right? I think people should retain those things, right? And that's part of moving to the United States, is that we do become Americanized, but we maintain a lot of our culture from the country that we came from, right? Yeah, I think that's a good thing. Not everyone agrees with me, and I hope you can see that, right? All right. So those are the elements of culture. Those are really important, right? I talked about language, values, norms. Yeah. And language is important. And language is just a system of symbols, right? But it allows us to transmit cultural transmission from one person to the next. If an immigrant comes here, we can teach them about our culture, right? If I move to another country, they can teach me about their culture, right? And also, as I raise my kids, I have to transmit culture to them and teach them through that. And that's what we call socialization, and that's the next chapter that we're going to talk about, right? Let me try to move this on. I want to talk next about values. Norms are derived from our values, right? And I won't go into a great detail about that because it's an intro course, but I will point out that people have studied, and there's a famous sociologist called Robin Williams, and he identified the main values in the United States. These are equal opportunity, achievement and success, material comfort, activity and work, practicality and efficiency, progress, science, freedom, free enterprise, and the last one, which you might say, oh, that contradicts some of the other ones, particularly democracy and free enterprise and equal opportunity. The last one is racism and group superiority, right? That's those are American values too, for better or for worse, right? But they are part of our American values. So let's talk about each one of these, right? The first one, equal opportunity. Most Americans agree that there should be equal opportunity. At least in theory, everyone should be able to achieve the American dream, work hard, go to school, and, make lots of money. Like theoretically, it's likely that everyone can do that. Certainly not equal likelihood. And we also don't believe in equality so much, right? And you might think we don't. No, we believe in equal opportunity. And typically, when I talk about this to students, I was like, ask them this: do you think everyone should live in exactly the same type of house and drive exactly the same car and wear exactly the same clothes, right? And most people are like, no, that sounds horrible, right? Yeah. That's because we don't really believe in equality that much. We believe in equal opportunity, right? Yeah. So, and that's different. That is quite different. Big, important differences, right? That everyone should have the opportunity to achieve more, right? And that's probably one reason why you're in college, is you want these opportunities to achieve more, right? Hopefully you're working hard. And that leads me to the second value, achievement and success, right? We believe that those people who work harder, dedicate their time, have discipline and stuff like that, that they should be rewarded for that. And people that don't do those things are considered lazy and frowned upon. And we organize the world in a way that rewards achievement and success for the most part. Not always, right? We do have a lot of people that just inherit wealth, and that's, I suppose you can argue that's the achievement of their parents or something like that, or grandparents or something like that. But anyway, the next thing is material comfort. We really enjoy material comfort, right? It's no accident that in the United States, we invented the Cadillac, right? And I used to have a Cadillac, right? And I loved the thing, right? And I always said that driving a Cadillac is like sitting in a lazy boy driving down the road, right? And the lazy boy, that's also an American invention, like, the reclining chair and stuff like that, right? That's American as apple pie, right? Cadillacs and lazy boys, because we like material comfort, right? In a way that a lot of other cultures don't, If you look at their furniture and you look at their vehicles, they're more Spartan, they're simpler, they're not padded to the same extent, right? The next thing is activity and work. This is somewhat similar to achievement and success. It's like we like people that are doers and get after it, right? That are highly motivated, right? That, don't sit on their butt and wait for things that are handed to them, right? That's activity and work, right? And you might think, don't all cultures? No, not really. Not really. In fact, some other cultures that differ than us is like in Central America and also in South America, they have these practices of that's my neighborhood kids coming over to play with my daughter. My son's taking care of it. You probably see them over in this part, right? Riley, you can come on in. You want to say hi to everyone? That's my son, Grayson. Riley, how are you? We're making a video. You want to say hi to my students?
Hi. Hi. It's like FNAF. You see, like, in the distance. Hi.
Yeah. Well, let me get back to my video.
Oh, okay.
All right. You want me to play the guitar? I'm not sure my students are prepared to listen to my guitar. All right. Let me get back to this because I got to finish this video, buddy. My son wants me to show off my musical talents or lack thereof. Right? He wants me to play the guitar for y'all, but I won't do that today. Right? Yeah, I think I was on activity and work, right? So I'm going down this list of American values that are identified by Robin Williams, right? Practicality and efficiency. The American people are pragmatic. We like results, right? And we believe and we have a value of progress. We often believe that our social world continues to get better, that civilization continues to get better. And maybe occasionally it gets a little bit worse, but just hold on. We have a strong faith in progress, right? The next thing is, we strongly believe in science, right? Although that some of these values have come under attack in recent years, particularly in relation to COVID. There's a kind of doubt about scientific value, especially vaccines and stuff like that. With that, otherwise, most of the history of the United States, there's experts, they have scientific knowledge. Let's listen to them. I still think we should do that, right? So, like when I go to the doctor and I take my kids to the doctor and they're like, "Give me advice," I'm like, "All right, what does the research show?" Right? And they tell me what the research says. I was like, "Let's go with that," because there's a reason why you're my doctor, because you're an expert, and I trust the experts, right? I trust the experts with my kids' health, even, right? I don't, watch a bunch of videos and think I know better than them, right? That's science, right? We value scientific knowledge, right? And certainly everyone at the university should and probably does, right? The next thing is democracy and free enterprise. We believe that our leaders should be elected. Now, by a majority, not exactly, right? Not exactly a majority of the votes wins, right? And but we do have a system, right? A representatives system or republic / democracy. Not exactly the same thing, very close, right? And we also believe in free enterprise. The federal government really shouldn't meddle in people's businesses too much. A little bit, perhaps, but not too much, right? And we strongly believe in freedom, right? That people should be able to travel, that they should be able to say what they want to say, right? That they should have First Amendment rights. And, it's only when your freedom affects someone else negatively should we kind of curtail our freedoms. And boy, do we celebrate this value of freedom. Like we like to think that we're the freest people in the world and stuff like that, right? The last thing is racism and group superiority. And this is, I don't know, maybe the dark side of America, right? That we strongly believe in hierarchy, and that some people should be in dominant groups and some people be in subordinate groups, right? Some people believe that about race, and they're white supremacists. right? But, most people believe that about class, right? That, most people agree that there should be rich people and there should be poor people. Now, what should determine who's rich? And we don't always agree upon that, right? But we believe in hierarchy. And we also believe that some inequality, right? We talked about that at the very beginning. Is like some inequality is justified, right? That some of it is good for society. And that's why we don't believe everyone should have the same car and the same size house and, the same amount of money in their bank accounts and stuff like that, right? So there's some class inequality. There's some race. There's some gender inequality. There's some inequality based upon religion. And throughout the history of the United States, to varying degrees, there's been consistency about that. And there's, that's part of the American story. I don't think it's good. In fact, I think it's horrible, right? But that's part of the American story. And it explains a lot of people's resistance to racial equality, gender equality, class inequality. That a lot of people believe that some of that is justified. Do not count me as one of those, right? But it is a value that many people believe in, and perhaps some of you more than others in this class, right? That's American values. I hope that you can see, like, as I go through there, those American values and stuff. I was about to mention an example earlier when we were talking about activity and work. And sorry, I didn't finish this thought because we had visitors come in, right? We value activity and work. And you might be thinking, everybody does. But go to South American countries, Central American countries, some Mediterranean countries, and they have practices. They have many more vacation days. In fact, in a lot of places in Central and South America, they'll close down shop in the middle of the day and they'll go home and have a nap. And we call that a siesta. Is there really any equivalent to a siesta in the United States? No. And, try to own a shop and close down every day for lunch. And people are like, what the hell are you doing? What do you mean you're going to close down, go home, and take a nap? Because that practice is foreign to our culture. We believe, wake up before the sun comes up and you work, right? And you work a long, hard day, right? That's the value. Now, sometimes maybe I don't agree with that value. I don't like to work long, hard days over and over again, 5-6 days a week and stuff like that. I like my leisure, right? And I like my material comfort. I like my freedom to not do things other than work. So you can see that all of these values, they often contradict each other, right? Freedom, material comfort, democracy, racism, and group support, they conflict, right? That's part of the American story, is how you have these contradictory values, and how is that going to play out? How has it played out in individuals? How has it played out over decades? Social movements like civil rights movements, feminist movement, and so on, right? That's how all these things interact over time, individuals, and they're constantly in flux, right? Yeah. All right, let's talk about norms. We already talked about norms, I do want to talk about, these rules and expectations that guide our behavior And I want to talk about how there's mores, which is spelled mores, but it's a French word, so it's pronunciated mores, and folkways. And, you know, a minute ago when I talked about norms, I was like, some of them have serious sanctions. Some of them are minor. Talked about killing someone unjustifiably. And then we also talked about greeting norms, right? Well, mores are norms that are widely observed and have great moral significance, right? So typically, if you violate one of those, it's going to be hell to pay, so to speak, right? There's going to be significant sanctions. One of the strongest norms in our society prohibits sexual behavior between adults and other adults, and adults and children, right? So it is, you don't have sexual interactions with children. You don't have sexual interactions with other adults unless they consent to that. And of course, children cannot consent. And if someone violates that more, right, or norm, they will do, and they should, right, horrible things to you, right? And some of the things that they will do, some of those sanctions will come from the state. But also, you know, if in my neighborhood we heard about someone that attempted or did do something to a small kid, me and my neighbors might get to that person before the police do, right? And those are sanctions, right? So the mores are like, oh man, that's a worst thing you could have done. Absolute worst thing, unimaginable that you won't even think about it, right? Folkways are just the opposite of that, right? They're like the greeting norms. They're norms for routine or casual interaction, right? You know, people will think you're rude if you don't shake their hand, and they'll talk about you. But you know, they won't. Neighborhood adults won't form a posse and, you know, enact vigilante justice, and, you know, the police won't come and arrest you. They're not shaking people. Those are folkways. All right. All norms and all the accompanying sanctions are always an attempt by society to control and regulate people's thoughts and behaviors. This is what we call social control. Right? Society's always controlling us, right? It's controlling me right now. It's controlling you as you think about this video. Now, it's not perfect control, all right? There's still, you know, some agency or ability to choose, but it's affecting what choices I make. Even if I have choices, they're kind of limited, and some seem better than others, and society kind of determines that, right? Let's move on, right? I'm trying to keep this brief. I'm failing miserably. Sorry. But let's move on in the interest of brevity, right? Let's talk about technology and culture. Earlier, I talked about technology and like what anthropology call artifacts. And there's this idea that technology has far-reaching consequences. Whoever's ringing that, could you ask them to stop? I apologize. I've never made a video with more interruptions. Would you remind them that I'm filming a video?
I'm sorry, we're being dumb.
Yeah. Well, I'm not gonna. I don't want to say it, but could you take charge, Mary Alice, and tell everyone to please be quiet for at least 15 more minutes. All right. I was talking about technology and its important role. Some people, like Gerhard Linsky, argue that technology determines everything else. That's what we call technological determinism, right? And Gerhard Linsky is a technological determinist. And he argued that our shift from simple technology, spears, digging sticks, bow and arrows and things like that. The technology that's common in hunting and gathering type societies. Guys, please. You gotta take the dog, you gotta leave here and let me record this because you're interrupting me. He argues that like in hunting and gathering type societies, the earliest type society, the technology really matters. It's digging sticks, spears, bows and arrows, arrowheads and stuff like that. As technology changes, we get new types of societies. The second type of society that evolves is horticultural and pastoral society, right? And that is, horticultural is about the domestication of plants. Pastoral is about the domestication of animals. This is the type of society, if you grew up going to church like me and going to Bible school and stuff like that, think about biblical times, right? Think of all that talk about shepherds and separating the goats from the sheep and, and then also the horticultural side of that, of like the sower and the seeds and the mustard seed, and those are all analogies that come from horticultural and pastoral societies. Horticultural societies typically come from river valleys. In the Bible, that's the Euphrates and the Tigris, the Mesopotamian. The pastoral societies are typically in deserts, more arid regions, right? That is true not only of biblical times, but that is true around the globe and different continents, right? And the type of technology is really important for them is not the technology of hunting and gathering societies, but it's like the shepherd's crook, right? The Balaic sling, which is like what David killed Goliath with, right? That was used on Goliath to kill him, if you know that Bible story. But it's also it's traditionally used to throw at prey, wolves, things that might eat the sheep or the goats or the cattle, right, or the chickens or whatever, right? Yeah, and also like important in horticulture is like you start to see some accumulation of wealth. In hunting and gathering type societies, people live hand to mouth. They don't become rich. Horticultural and pastorals, you can, because you can kind of start storing grain and stuff, and you get more advanced types of society. And because some people farm and some people domesticate, you also get other trades as well. Other people don't have to farm. They don't have to domesticate. They can kind of live off the fat of the land is the same, right? And you get the beginning of trades, right? The next type of society is called agrarian. And this is where we depend more on agriculture. It's different though than horticultural in the sense that it harnesses the power of animals. So you put a yoke on the oxen, right? And you till the land. You use a mule. You use horses. So it's about harnessing more powerful. And the yoke is a really, I'm assuming y'all know what a yoke is. You put it around the donkey or the cow, and that allows you to walk behind and plow the land, right? And that's a more advanced form of horticultural, right? We kind of talked about societies and the way that they emerged, and we're kind of up to 1600s, 1700s, you start to see a new type of society that we call an industrial society. And most of us learned quite a lot about industrial societies and how they developed in 1700s and 1800s. And we learned about Henry T. Ford, the assembly line, interchangeable parts, all this kind of stuff. I'm assuming cotton gin and like, all these kind of important technological innovations of the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, right? And how that changes society, right? Now, we kind of live in an industrial society, but we kind of live in a post-industrial society. There are other places that are more industrialized now than the United States. In fact, most of our factories left, and you see that throughout Alabama and throughout the country, particularly in, areas of Bessemer, all the factories left, right? And we've kind of, in a lot of ways, moved on to a new type of society. We haven't really reached a consensus about what to call that, right? The textbook calls it post-industrial. You might also like information age. 10 years ago, they were saying postmodern. That's kind of taken on some new connotations and is not used quite as often. Information age, this kind of stuff, right? And in this new type of society, and you guys are often more proficient at this technology than I am, right? Because it is so new. And that's the technology of the computer, the smartphone, the internet, increasingly AI, right? And that's the technology that we believe is going to continue to kind of dominate our economy and our lives over the next 50, 100 years. Now, there'll be other forms of technology, some that haven't been created yet, right? And the world's rapidly changing, right? It's not the same place, when I was your age, right? It's certainly not the same place, right? And that has some big consequences. Maybe your parents are probably like my parents. They're like, you need to prepare yourself for a career in this new world. And they will give you advice that is probably quite dated, right? And after they give you this advice about how to make it in a post-industrial information age, they will then turn around and ask you, like, how do you convert a PDF? Right? Because they can't, this world is so new that they can't navigate it because they grew up in an industrial age, right? Yeah, I think that's kind of funny, right? And that's a big problem for parents, right? And always has been. Maybe it's getting worse. That I grew up in an industrial age, and my dad grew up more in industrial age, right? He was a boomer and grew up, and he would give me advice. I was like, Dad, that works really great if I have to find a job in the 1950s. Right? But I had to find a job in the 90s and 2000s and stuff like that. And the world that he grew up and knew about in the 1950s, it had changed, right? And maybe your parents are probably my age or maybe a little bit younger, right? I might be closer to the age of your grandparents, which might bring me to tears. But you might be more savvy with the technology of a post-industrial society than your parents are, right? All of us kind of know this, right? So there used to be a New Yorker cartoon that demonstrated this perfectly, right? You know how old people always ask the young people about their phones and about the internet and stuff like that. And my dad, comes and asks me, he's like, "Oh, my printer won't work on my computer. Can you help me fix it and stuff?" And but I'm getting older, right? And maybe I gotta ask, my 10-year-old or something like that. But there's this famous New Yorker cartoon where it depicts a really old person, and he's asking the baby something about, "Can you help me fix my computer?" And he's asking the youngest person that they can find, like a little baby that can't even walk or talk or anything like that. And they're hoping that this really young person is going to be able to understand this new fancy technology, right? So, yeah, that's, there's a little commentary about where we are and why the older people have to ask y'all, like, how do you convert a PDF again? And, why won't my Bluetooth connect? And now, what is AI? What's that stand for? All right. No, we've already kind of talked about subculture. We haven't really talked about high culture and popular culture. When we talk about high culture, that's cultural patterns of the elite of wealthy people, right? And when we talk about pop culture, that's more for the masses, right? So if I told you I'm gonna take my wife out, maybe my kids too, if they're not too noisy, and we're gonna enjoy some high culture this weekend, you should, if you understand the meaning of that, you should expect us to like go to the art museum or see a ballet or go to the symphony or something like that, right? You would not expect me to go to, this is where I'm old, right? God, what's the guy that's playing at the Super Bowl? Oh, goodness. I can't remember his name now. But he's, you guys probably know, he's like Puerto Rican, and you would not expect me to go to his concert. You would not expect me to play the music through streaming of rock or rap or something like that, because that's pop culture, right? That's culture that's produced for the masses, not for a few elite wealthy people that pay a big ticket price, but for millions of people, and each one, when they stream it, they get a fraction of a penny. But because it's so many of them, right? And those fractions of pennies, sometimes they add up, sometimes they don't, right? But think of like tickets for concerts and stuff like that. They sell out arenas and stadiums and stuff like that. Pop cultural artists do, and they get a little bit from each fan, not a lot from each fan, like high culture. But when you add all those little bits, you can make a really great living, right? That's pop culture, or mass culture, right? That's important, right? Yeah, that's important. And you'll likely encounter some questions about that. Let me talk a little bit about multiculturalism, Eurocentrism, Afrocentrism, androcentrism, multiculturalism. And I said we live in a multicultural, right? Although sometimes these things are politically contentious, right? Multiculturalism is this perspective that we should recognize the diversity within our own culture, particularly the United States, right? And that we should promote the equality of all cultures. Don't see them in a hierarchy, right? Like this is the dominant and these are the subordinate or the less than or something like that. But we should value all of them, and they all play an important part in this multicultural society, right? At the same time, we have to recognize that the United States it's been affected by some cultures more than others, and those cultures are those of Western Europe, right? I mean, we speak English for the most part. That's the dominant spoken language. American cuisine is influenced mostly by European cuisine. We are Eurocentric, right? Even when I teach sociology, I teach you about old white Europeans, right? Now, there are other sociologists from other countries, and they're not all white, and they're not all European. they're not all male, right? And we will get to those people, right? But this discipline, just like the United States, is kind of Eurocentric, right? Now, we are trying to change that in sociology. I'm trying to change that in sociology. But just like history, you take a history class, who do you hear the most about? Europeans, mostly white people, mostly upper class people, mostly males and stuff like that. So, like, this is not unique to sociology. Every discipline at the university is Eurocentric, right? With the exception of maybe like African American studies, Native American studies, and stuff like that. And that's one of the reasons why we have those things at universities is to counterbalance the Eurocentric tendencies of the university, right? All right. Another thing, like we have African American Studies program in a minor here, and in that program, and you should expect it to be, and it's a good thing that it is, tends to be Afrocentric. It's trying to provide a counterweight to the Eurocentric tendencies of the university, right? And emphasize the cultural contributions of Africa in the African diaspora, right? All the people that left, some forcibly through slave, but some left through other means, like willingly left and immigrated. And and so that's, the opposite of Eurocentric, African-centric, right? And if you're interested in Afrocentrism and like the celebration and like think of Kwanzaa and things like that, and traditional African dress, right? And styles and ways of wearing your hair and all sorts of stuff like that. If you're interested in that, you should consider taking an African American Studies class, and some of y'all probably are, right? Or you already know about all this stuff, and but there's some good people that teach in the classes, and I've taught some of those classes as well. Really enjoyed it, right? All right. The next thing I want to talk about is counterculture and subculture. And I think I'll try to wrap it up here soon. All right. I've talked about subcultures. Like within our culture, there can be subcultures, like cultures that are kind of set apart, right? Ethnic subcultures, Chinatown, Little Italy, Little Russia, these kind of neighborhoods in bigger cities and stuff like that. Great example of subcultures, right? There's also subcultures surrounding all sorts of sports and activities. And, when I was growing up, I was big into skateboarding. That's a great example of like a subculture. And you're involved in subcultures like music subcultures and stuff like that, right? Now, countercultures are different, and most people don't belong in many of these, but perhaps you have some exposure, right? Here's a great example of a counterculture, right? Hell's Angels, right? That's different. That's not just a part of culture that's kind of set aside and different. Hell's Angels and Mongols and other outlaw biker gangs, not clubs, right? They have values and norms that run counter to mainstream society. If you know anything about these, they believe that women are property, right? They don't believe in necessarily following the law either, and if you break the law, they kind of celebrate that instead of sanctioning and gossiping about people that do that, right? That's the difference between a biker outlaw gang like the Mongols or the Hell's Angels, and that's very different than your uncle that maybe rides a Harley on the weekend and he meets his friends at the bar and they have a few beers and but then Monday comes around, they take off their leather jacket and they go back to work, right? A biker club, that's conformists belong to that, right? An outlaw gang, that is a counterculture, not a subculture, right? There's a little bit at the end of this, but I'm gonna, try to call it. I guess I'm gonna cut it off right here, right? But you do need to be familiar with these theories of culture, right? I've already gone an hour and 5 minutes, and if you struggled through all this with all the disruptions of my children and my neighbors and the dog barking, then you probably are at the limits of your attention span, if not far past it, right? But you should be familiar with those theories of culture, particularly structural functionalists, their attention to cultural universals and how those function, right? And then also social conflict and how cultural practices can benefit some to the detriment of others, can produce and reproduce inequality, right? In conflict between different cultures. We've talked about like conflict between white culture and black culture, male culture and female cultures, like the cultures of elites and wealthy people versus common people and stuff like that. And so that's an arena for conflict, right? And also conflict between different ethnic groups. Some needs to be said about that, given where our society is, right? Conflict between Eurocentric elements of our society and Hispanic ethnicities, right? And how that is an arena for inequality, and how some people will dominate others, and there will be winners and there will be losers, right? And that is a struggle for rights. It is a struggle for resources, money, income, wealth, right? And and then it talks a little bit about sociobiology, right? And this kind of overlap between sociology and biology. And I'm going to let you learn about all those things on your own, because I need to stop talking and I need to turn off this video, right? And I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and I'll post a different video next week. It'll be a video for the discussion board. Y'all have a nice day.